So I'd like to thank the organizers of this event. Thank you so much for inviting us to present our food environment framework. But to start, I would like to put the framework into context by providing some background into the projects that led to the development of the framework. And I realized that Professor Amosla touched a bit on it, but I'll just want to briefly say one or two things about these two projects. My slides are not moving. Just 1 second, please. Okay. So I'm presenting this on behalf of the project team. So these projects were, there were two sister projects, and it was a collaboration between a number of institutions. So as you can see on your screen, it was two universities from Ghana.
We cannot yet
You still
see
can't
your
see. Right. Okay. Apologies. I wonder if I could get Phyllis to share it for me, because
Phyllis, if you can share it.
Yeah, I say if you can share the slides for me from your end, that would be helpful. I keep having this problem.
Okay, I'm doing that right now.
Thank you, Prof. Yeah.
Okay.
Is it here?
We can see it.
Yeah. Okay, here.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. Yeah, so I was just trying to acknowledge the entire team. So these two projects were a collaboration between a number of institutions. So as you can see, we have two universities from Ghana, University of Ghana and University of Health and Allied Science, Ghana. Then I need to apologize in advance. I have my little boy here.
We understand. And then please, you should be able to. You should be able to moderate the slides from your end.
Okay.
You've been your remote control is enabled. So go ahead. You can change the slides.
Prof, it's not moving at my end.
Click on the slide. Oh, okay, then I'll do it for you.
Yes, it's not. I'm trying, but it's not. Yeah. Right. Okay. I also acknowledge our funders. So these two projects were funded by the first one was funded by the Drivers of Food Choice Competitive Grants Program, and then the second one was funded by the Global Challenges Research Fund. Next slide, please. I would skip this because I realized that Prof. Amos already touched on this, and I'll just go on to the aims of those two projects, which were to, just a slide before. Yeah, so the two projects had three broad aims, were to assess the current food consumptions and dietary practices in African cities. And then the second one was to examine the factors in the urban food environment, that drove dietary behaviors, especially the unhealthy food and beverages consumption. And then the third one was to use insights from these learnings to develop or to identify context-relevant interventions and policies to promote health. Now, why did we investigate the food environment? It was because of two main reasons, and the previous speaker just touched on some of them. The first of these reasons was the fact that up until now, we still have very little evidence to show how the food environment influences dietary behaviors. Most of the research we have done so far in Africa focuses on the individual level drivers. But we all know from public health that, usually when you do interventions at the individual level, it has very little success because it doesn't take into consideration the context in which people live in. And this framework, which is a socio-ecological framework, was what informed our research. It's specifically the one that was developed by Story et al. From the United States. So this framework divides the factors or the food environment into 4 levels. So the individual factors, which talks about things like knowledge, attitude, practices, which is something that most of us would have at least published or done some research on. It also touches on the social environment, which refers to the social network, our peers, our families, And then the physical environment that talks about the physical structure, so the neighborhood, the home environment, that where the social environment is situated. And then finally, the macro level environment, which refers to national policies, things to do with marketing and yes, among others. Yes, please. Can we move on to the next slide? Thank you. Now, so still talking about these two projects, I'll briefly touch on what we did, because some of these things fed into the development, the framework development. Okay, so our methodology span from the local level to the international level. And at the local level, we did a photo voice study where we provided participants in Ghana and Kenya with cameras and asked them to take photos from the food environment, identify factors in the social and physical level that influences dietary behaviors. Now, at the international level, we also did a systematic review of the determinants of dietary behaviors, and these two fed into the development. We did so many things, but I'm not talking about these because these didn't directly feed into the framework. Now, let me start talking about the framework. So we had two broad aims when we're developing the framework. The first one was to develop a framework that is culturally adapted for the urban African context. And then the second thing we did was to identify factors that are a priority for research and interventions in urban Africa. So I'm going to talk about how we went about developing this framework. So we did this in 3 different phases. In phase 1, we used the evidence, what I just described earlier, from the primary studies, so the findings from the photo voice exercise, the systematic review that we did, and then secondary data analysis that we did. And then we also relied on eminence. Eminence here just refers to expertise from within the projects, because there's so many people in the project who had experience working in the food environment. And then we also relied on expertise from outside the project. Okay, so we put this together in phase 1 to generate a list of factors, which we described as the draft framework, arranged in that order, like what I showed you in the socio-ecological framework. Now, in phase 2, we conducted an online survey where we sent the draft framework to members of the African Nutrition Society. And then we asked them 3 questions. The first one was for them to assess what we had developed and tell us how comprehensive the draft framework was. Then the second one was for them to try and see if there were any other factors from the food environment that we had omitted. And then the final one was for them to score these factors according to its importance for dietary behaviors. We also did a second evaluation at the last ANEC conference in Ethiopia, where we got a lot of nutrition experts. I mean, in total, we had about 71 nutrition experts. And then we asked them to repeat the same exercise we did with the ANS members. And all these experts were from 26 African countries with multidisciplinary backgrounds. Now, in the final phase, what we did was to compare our framework with the Story et al. Framework, and to just look for commonalities and similarities in the factors from the food environment. So I'm just going to show you some of the factors that we identified. So this is just the one for the shared factors. So the shared factors between the framework we developed and the Story et al. Socio-ecological framework. As you can see, there were about, as always, up to 25, so many factors from the individual level, but the ones that you see in bold were the ones that had a higher score in terms of their importance when it comes to dietary behaviors. So for individual levels, socioeconomic status, food habits, and preferences, food preferences, stood out as the most important ones. At the social environment level, we family food practices was the most important that was identified. At the physical level, you see availability of foods, and then also factors like convenience. And then at the macro level, we had food prices being the most important factor in the macro level that we should be considering. Then we also had this one to represent the ones that we tend to describe as specific to the urban African setting. mainly because these factors were not in the socio-ecological framework that we used. So if you look at the macro level, we have factors like dietary guidelines, human resources like, nutritionists. And indeed, if you look at Africa, there are so many countries that still don't have national dietary guidelines. But the most important factor at that level was seasonality. If you look at the physical environment, factors like food adulteration and contamination emerged. There was also neighborhood sanitation and hygiene, which was something that came up a lot in our photo voice exercise. At a social environment level, we had factors like traditional taboos and household composition, and also how food allocation, how food is allocated in people's homes. Then finally, we had women's empowerment as the most important, the one that had the highest score from the individual level. Next slide, please. So what is this telling us? What this tells us is that, and I was happy that the previous speaker mentioned this, that drivers of food choice cut across all the levels of the food environment. So what this implies is that policies and interventions are needed at multiple levels and not just the individual levels. Okay, another thing our findings tell us is that we had about 50 factors, about 50 factors that were specific to the African context, urban context, but these factors are not currently captured or accounted for in the existing portfolio of recommendations, to prevent NCD. So this is something that, policymakers should take into consideration. And can we go to the next slide, please? Right. So in conclusion, we just say that because food price seemed to be like the most important one, we say policies to reduce the price of healthier foods should be explored. We also say that there's a need for us to develop interventions that address the Africa-specific factors that have emerged. And then we should also focus on developing home-based family interventions to improve dietary behaviors. Yes, I think my last slide. And then, so in terms of recommendations for further research, we suggest that there's a need for research that to research the broader food environment, as well as identify pathways of the factors that influence dietary behavior. So our photo voice exercise, identified that pathway, but that was just for the social environment. So we need to do more to be able to identify the pathways and understand which interventions could have the capacity to address one or two or three of those factors across the levels. We also say that there's a need to explore and evaluate existing interventions to promote healthy diets in a way that goes beyond what works. We shouldn't just be looking out for what works, but we should also look out for whom and under what context, especially when it comes to women and adolescents. Yeah, so I'll end here. Thank you.